Welcome to the Europe Direct podcast with myself, Barry O'Carroll. This podcast is part of our series on mental health, and we're doing this due to the recent publication of the EU Mental Health Initiative. I'm joined once again by Amber Roche, who has been with us several times now to discuss mental health issues. You're very welcome, Amber.
Hi, Barry. Thank you for having me on again.
I'm delighted to have you on. And listen, today's one is really, really interesting because what we want to do in this podcast is demystify the therapeutic process. Now, in the past, we have spoken about when things maybe get a bit too much for you, it might be the time to think about considering counselling, psychotherapy. And so in this podcast, we want to maybe talk about that. And what's interesting is we're going to talk about it from two perspectives. So you as the therapist, and then me, somebody who's been through the therapeutic process. So we'll be able to kind of give both sides to how the thing works. Obviously, everyone's experience is different, but hopefully what we say today might help some people who are maybe wavering and thinking, is this for me? It might help give them that little extra push to consider doing therapy. So
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Barry, for actually sharing your experience with myself and the listeners as well.
yeah, and like in the past, I suppose a lot of the questions I've directed to you, whereas today's one will be a bit more of a back and forth. I suppose I'll be sharing some of my experiences, and I'm more than happy to do it if it can help other people. So let's start. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got into psychotherapy as a career, and a little bit about your experience over the years?
Yes. So, Barry, I went back to study when I was, well, it was quite late. I suppose I was in my 30s when I went back to college. And myself, I always had an interest in psychology from a very young age, I would guess. It was a subject that really drew my interest. I liked to read a lot about it or delve into self-help books at the time. That's, I think, where my interest initially started. As a child, I would have grappled with anxiety myself. I didn't really understand what it was at the time. And it manifested in some OCD behaviors.
Okay.
I guess that was probably me as a child trying to gain control over my environment, which was quite difficult. I came from a home where there was a lot of conflict between my parents. I was an only child as well.
Right.
So really, I found myself alone a lot with my own thoughts, and I guess I was continuously seeking out ways to manage these thoughts and looking for ways just to help myself feel better. So when I left school, initially I went and I studied art and design, and then I traveled for a few years. And it was really when I was in my late 20s that I decided I wanted to go down that path of studying psychology and to make a career out of it.
Right.
And then I took the plunge. So initially I studied for a degree in psychology, and 2 years into that, I found that I was really drawn more into the psychotherapy modules.
Right.
So I switched over to a degree in psychotherapy and counselling. And I guess I never really looked back.
Yeah.
So I was studying for 6 years in total. After I qualified, I set up private practice. And I also worked along with people with learning disabilities. So I had private practice then at night. So it was really enjoyable. I'm so glad that I went into that area.
And it's interesting what you said about the childhood stuff, because you often hear that the concept of the wounded healer, somebody who suffered with anxiety and then goes on to help heal other people.
Yes, exactly. subsequently, Barry, I found out a couple of years ago that I have ADHD,
Right.
which would clearly explain the anxiety that I experienced as a child. A lot of people who have a diagnosis of ADHD will have experienced anxiety or depression. And as I said, I often had quite OCD. I had a lot of OCD behaviors, and
Yes.
that would take the form of counting, or I would have rituals, didn't want to step over cracks and
Yes.
pavements,
Yes.
these kind of things. And they were all my own way of trying to control an environment where that felt very out of control for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I mean I'm going to share some of my experiences with you, and I can relate a lot to that. Um, Now when we did a first podcast, we actually spoke about some of the kind of common issues that people bring to therapy. Can you just remind us maybe what some of those are?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of things that people will present with. I suppose the typical ones would be depression or
Mm,
anxiety.
yeah.
But then people may seek therapy for more serious mental health conditions such as bipolar disorder,
Mhm.
PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, phobias,
Mm,
panic disorder, addictions,
yes.
including alcoholism, drug dependence, or gambling,
Right.
eating disorders such as anorexia or bulimia. So people will enter into therapy for a whole host of reasons.
Yeah. And
And I
we've
guess, yes,
yeah, so we've spoken about a few of those before, like definitely anxiety, depression, but there was two there that are kind of interest to me there to know a little bit more about. One is bipolar, you mentioned. Could you tell us
yes.
a little bit more about what bipolar is?
So this is really when we're going into the more clinical end of disorders, and where a person would really need to see a specialist in the area. So bipolar disorder, or as it was known, it was also known as manic depression.
Mm,
So it's a chronic long-term condition, and it involves intense mood changes that will disrupt the person's everyday life.
yeah,
So it wouldn't be your normal mood swing as
yeah,
such.
yeah,
These would be extreme
yeah. Okay.
highs to extreme lows. And bipolar disorders often develops for the first time during teenage years or early adulthood, and it tends to affect females more than males.
Really, and it develops a bit later, as you say, rather than childhood. It's more teenage and adult. That's interesting.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes. So a person with bipolar disorder goes through mood changes that will range between manic and depressive
Mm,
episodes. So the manic or hypomanic episodes, the person may feel very euphoric or high.
hmm.
Hypomania symptoms are like those of a manic episode, but they're less severe
Right.
and they don't last as long. During hypomanic episodes, changes in mood are less severe, but it means that they're less likely to affect the person's functioning.
Okay.
Then there are the depressive episodes, and that's when the person will feel really low,
Hmm.
hopeless, very sad.
So it tends to
So
go to extremes rather than kind of in the middle. Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. If you have bipolar disorder, what you're experiencing during each episode and for how long, it varies from person to person. And an episode can last for weeks or even months.
Wow.
The moods, they may not make sense in the context of what the person is currently going through in
Yeah.
their life. You can treat bipolar disorder effectively, but it needs very careful and ongoing management.
Mm. And
And
would it need
treatment
medication?
usually, yes, it
Okay.
involves long-term medication and some psychological therapy and often lifestyle changes as well.
Okay.
So most people with bipolar disorder are first prescribed medicines to stabilize the mood.
Okay.
and their doctor or psychiatrist will choose and adjust medicines to suit the person's specific needs.
And sometimes would it be right to say that you mightn't get the medicines right first time round? It can take a bit of experimentation to.
Yes, absolutely. Some people won't tolerate certain medications.
Okay.
And typically the medications used would be mood stabilizers or antipsychotics.
Okay.
Mm.
So that's a really like I said in the previous podcast we spoke about kind of the more common ones, anxiety, depression, and stress. But bipolar is something a little more specific, as you say, a little more clinical. And there was one other
Yes.
I'd like you to expand on there. You spoke about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Could you
Yes.
expand on that one a little bit?
Yes. PTSD, I guess it's an acronym that we're hearing a lot of at the moment. There's a lot of people talking about it. And PTSD, it's an anxiety disorder, and it's caused by very stressful, frightening, or
Right.
distressing events.
Yeah.
Someone with PTSD, they often relive the traumatic event through nightmares, flashbacks, and they may experience feelings of isolation, irritability, guilt,
Right.
shame. They may also have problems sleeping, such as insomnia, or they could find concentrating really difficult.
Yeah.
So the symptoms are often severe and persistent enough to have a significant impact on the person's day-to-day life.
And can I just ask, like, what kind of things could trigger PTSD?
Any situation that a person finds traumatic can potentially cause PTSD. But some of the more serious, I suppose, situations that a person may have experienced could be a serious road accident, a violent personal assault, such as a sexual assault, a mugging, robbery, serious health problems.
Okay.
Sometimes a person may be diagnosed with an illness which will cause them to also experience PTSD.
And can I just add one to?
Yes.
Sorry, go on, Amber. Yeah, finish your thought there before I.
Women who've had really difficult childbirth experiences can also develop PTSD.
Okay, and like we're actually going to do another podcast in the future specifically aimed at migrants and also refugees. And we're seeing a lot of people in Ireland coming in, especially from Ukraine at the moment. And I've spoken to some of them who've been through some incredibly traumatic experiences. So this is a topic we might look at in a bit more detail in another podcast. Because I mean, people fleeing war, I mean, it's one of the biggest traumas you can experience.
Yes, of course. It really is. And a lot of the people that have fled those countries will inevitably be suffering with some form of PTSD.
Yeah.
And it can develop immediately after someone experiences a disturbing event, or it can occur weeks, months, or even years later. It's estimated to affect about 1 in every 3 people who've had a traumatic experience.
Okay.
But it's not really clear why some people develop the condition and others don't.
Right.
So people who repeatedly experience traumatic situations, such as severe neglect, abuse, or violence, they may be diagnosed with more complex PTSD.
Okay.
And complex PTSD can cause similar symptoms to PTSD, and it may not develop until years after the event.
Wow.
It's often more severe if the trauma was experienced early in life, and this can affect a child's development.
Right. Okay.
It's normal to experience upsetting and confusing thoughts after a traumatic event. And most people, they can move on and they can improve naturally over time.
Right.
But you should see a doctor if you or your child are still having problems, like about 4 weeks after the traumatic experience, or if the symptoms are particularly troublesome.
Yeah.
And if necessary, then your GP can refer you to a specialist for further assessment and treatment.
Yeah.
PTSD, it can be successfully treated, even
Okay.
when it develops many years after the traumatic event. And that can occur because a lot of the times people will forget the event,
Okay.
and that's the brain's way of managing.
It's a coping mechanism, is it?
It's a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
So a person may have forgotten, but
Mm.
often it's the body that will remember the trauma.
Ah,
And something can trigger that. It may be even a smell,
right.
just seeing something similar, and then the person is flooded with memories
Yeah.
around the original event.
And it's often said smell is one of the strongest triggers, isn't it,
Yes,
of memories in general.
it it is, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So again, it's the body and how the body remembers.
Okay. And I mean,
Um,
I certainly know people in my life who have suffered traumatic events, and it's true that years later, uh, the effect is still there, and can come back quite suddenly.
yes,
So like you said, as you said, this is something that can happen years later.
yeah, that's true. Um, and as I said, people, they can't forget. And the therapies, I suppose, that are recommended are talking therapies,
Hmm.
such as trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy,
Right.
or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is called EMDR.
Yeah, that.
Also, medication can be used.
Hmm.
But what is the most important thing is that the person feels safe again.
Yeah, yeah.
When a person is traumatized, they don't feel safe in
Mm,
their body.
yeah,
That's one of the huge things.
yeah.
And
And the other
there's a
thing is,
disconnect.
could I say something to you, Amber, that like over the last few years, I think the whole world suffered a major trauma with COVID. I mean, that was a
Yes,
very traumatic event. And I mean, is it fair to say that we were probably collectively suffering some kind of trauma after that? I mean, that was a pretty big deal what happened.
it was. Um, People have, I think, underestimated the knock-on effect of COVID
Mm,
regarding people's mental health.
yeah,
We we love connection. We're mammals
yeah,
essentially. And we need to connect with others. So isolating had really an awful effect on people's psyche.
yeah.
I know myself, I was living overseas
Hmm.
and I couldn't connect with my family at all.
Yeah.
I couldn't go back to Ireland for
Hmm.
3 years, really.
Wow,
I
wow.
was in Perth,
Yeah,
which is one of the most isolated cities in the world.
yeah, yeah.
And the government had a really hard border.
Mm,
So people weren't allowed into Perth or people weren't allowed out of Perth.
yeah.
Whilst we didn't experience lockdowns in the way that Ireland did,
Hmm.
it was not being able to travel, to be able to see my family
Yeah.
and friends that I guess had quite an effect on me.
Without a doubt. And
I
I
can go into
remember myself, like even, I mean, my parents lived quite close by, but for several years we had no real contact bar through a window or at a distance. And especially for my son, like for a child not to be able to see his grandparents and vice versa. And that was really tough going. And everybody experienced that. Absolutely everybody. I have friends in Germany, Mexico, Australia, you name it. And we all went through the same thing. I think it's the one time in humanity where we pretty much all suffered the same trauma. Every last one
yes,
of us.
and everybody has their own personal story of how they navigated their way through COVID, but everybody, in a sense, was affected by it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I feel really a lot of sadness for people who lost family members
Yeah.
or friends during the COVID period, and they couldn't attend a funeral.
Yeah.
There was no closure sometimes for people. There wasn't that symbolism and that we need as we go through a normal mourning process and the rituals of a funeral and a burial or a wake.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
very difficult for a
Yeah.
lot
And
of
I,
people.
I certainly, there was a few situations like that in my family and friend circle where we couldn't attend funerals. And yeah, that was tough going. I'm going to go back now to the subject of therapy itself. And
Yes.
I might share some of my own experience actually.
Yeah, I'd love to know about that, Barry. What was your experience of
Yeah,
therapy
well,
like as a client?
interestingly, like you, anxiety was what prompted me to decide this is something I think I need to do. And there were some of those OCD tendencies as well. That was kind of one of the signs for me that I remember I'd be doing these things, like checking things obsessively and thinking, this isn't, no, this isn't good.
Yeah.
Um, or and to the point where it might make me late for something because I'd be, I missed
Okay.
the bus or something like that. And also there was a physical manifestation, and we spoke about this in the very first podcast we ever did. A lot of the manifestations of mental health issues are physical. And for me, I wouldn't call it a pain, but I call it a sensation in the left side of my chest. Just this kind of
Okay.
sensation of pressure that would sometimes be there, sometimes not. And I couldn't explain it. And of course, because it was in my chest, that made me more anxious.
Yes,
And
of course.
and it was when I began to, of course, like we all do, you run to Dr. Google, and I looked it up,
Uh-huh.
which can be a terrible thing. But the one thing that cropped up time and time again in my searches was this word anxiety. Cropped up over and over and over. So that's what kind of prompted me. And yeah, it was beginning to affect things in my life, relationships, my own feeling of contentness. And at a time I was thinking, I'm in a good place. I've, a job I like, but yet I still had this sensation. And this
So
feeling, yeah,
your body was really giving you the signals that something was wrong. And there
definitely.
often is that disconnect
Mm,
that we don't actually understand what is happening.
yeah, yeah,
And as you've described, there was the physical
yeah,
manifestation.
yeah.
And we spoke about some of those physical manifestations of
We did,
anxiety,
we did, yeah.
rashes, and pains and aches and pains in the body, and just generally not feeling well, but not knowing what it is, or
Exactly.
that feeling of panic, waking up
Yeah,
with with a sense of dread.
exactly. That's the word, dread. Yeah.
Yes.
And sometimes you didn't know
Or
why.
it can be,
You wouldn't
yeah,
know why.
it
Couldn't
can be
connect it to
late at
anything.
night and
Yeah,
not being able to sleep and just endless thoughts running through your mind,
definitely,
just
without a doubt.
constantly going over. And
Yeah.
then I guess that sense of trying to control that,
Mm,
and having conversations in your head, just looking, searching for
yeah.
ways to get rid of that horrible feeling.
Yeah.
And we often call it free floating anxiety,
Mm,
where it's that sense of doom and gloom. You feel like something awful is about to happen, but you can't pinpoint what it is because on the
exactly.
outside, everything may present as being okay.
That's it. And the
You
thing is,
got the job, the house,
yeah, because it becomes your default, you kind of think that's normal, which is why I probably
normally.
didn't notice it for so long. And it was actually the physical manifestations that it was that and some other things, maybe other people noticing things that finally prompted me to say, do you know what? I think I have to do something about this. And listen, and I know you have experience of therapy as well, because when you're training, am I right in saying that to be a psychotherapist, you actually attend therapy yourself? So you've kind of got a unique perspective there from both sides. Could you say a little bit about your experiences there?
Yes. So part of the training is doing your own self-work. You can't really sit with a person unless you've done that work yourself.
Okay.
And it's not fair to your client either to sit there whilst they're telling their story or trying to work through something,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden you're focusing on your own stuff.
Mm.
And then, thinking, oh, yeah, I know what that's like. I've done that. Or,
Mm.
identifying with the client.
Mm.
You need to provide and hold that space for them. So it's
Yeah.
really important that the therapist does their own work. So
Okay.
part of the training is entering into therapy. But apart from that, Barry, I would say that I had my first experience of therapy probably in my early 20s.
Right.
Like that, I was experiencing a lot of anxiety. I
Mm.
was in college at the time, and I was feeling just overwhelmed quite a lot.
Mm.
And for me, what would happen is I would repetitively think about a situation and work it through from start to
Yes.
finish
Yes.
and preempting people's reactions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And
We've all
that,
done that. Yeah. Yeah. I know
oh,
that.
I was causing myself more and
Yeah.
more
And
anxiety.
your body's, and when you're thinking about these situations, your body's reacting as if they're happening. You're
Of
getting
course.
stressed, you're getting wound up, I'll
Yes.
say this to them, and and
Yeah.
everyone's had the argument in their head, even, this kind of.
Oh, yeah. The argument in the head. And it's so exhausting and also so time wasting.
Yes, gets you nowhere.
We don't know what's going to happen. We can't predict what another person is going to say or how they're going to react or
Exactly.
an outcome.
Yeah.
But that was me, I guess, again, trying to control an outcome or
Yeah.
trying to prepare myself for the worst case scenario.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
realistically, when I look back on it, I was in fight or flight a lot.
Of course.
I was constantly in the stress response.
Yeah.
And this was having a bad effect on me and my own mental health. So I remember going to see the college counselor at the time.
Mm.
And it was a bit daunting and a bit nerve-wracking at first. But I remember feeling a tremendous sense of relief,
Yes.
being able to actually get this off my chest
Mm.
and not to be so up in my own head.
Yeah.
I don't know, was that something that you experienced, Barry?
Without a doubt, because you internalize it a lot. And for the first time, instead of the conversations with myself, it was with somebody else. And the big thing is with somebody who didn't have a stake in the game, so to speak.
Yes.
And that was so important, because family and friends can be great, don't get me wrong. And I encourage people to talk to family and friends about issues they have. But sometimes some things are nearly too big for that. And you need a neutral perspective, a neutral sounding board. And even just the fact, as you say, of saying this stuff out loud rather than to
Yeah.
yourself. And sometimes you'd find yourself saying something, you go, where did that come from? I've never said that before. Wow, that's incredible. So that's definitely, yeah, that was a huge thing for me, and it was the first time I'd ever done that, really.
What
Scary
was it
too.
like, Barry?
Oh,
Were you nervous?
so the first time I ever went into therapy, yeah, oh, without a doubt, it was something I really wanted to do. I was determined to, this is something, I feel like I should. My personality is a bit like that. If I do something, I do it with gusto, which can be good
Yes.
and sometimes not so good. But I remember that first session because it was pouring rain. That's my first memory of it. Absolutely pouring rain. And my bus stopped several stops before it was meant to, and dumped us all out in the rain. So that kind of stressed me, and I had to cross over a good chunk of the city in this torrential rain, and I arrived absolutely soaking wet. And I remember going in, rang a buzzer, and up I went. And I suppose I was expecting, it was my image of therapy was very much the old style Freudian
Ah,
type, very cold. distant therapist who sits, you're lying on a couch and they're probably not even looking at you, or maybe there's a screen and it's all very much, how does that make you feel, and that kind of thing. What struck me when I went into my therapist was the warmth that this person showed me, because I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting something a lot more formal, and that immediately relaxed me. And I was obviously a bit stressed about that. I think I was probably a few minutes late. I was wet, and the therapist said, it's okay. Don't worry about it. That's fine. And so I immediately relaxed into it. But
Oh,
yeah,
that's
I was
great. Yeah.
definitely nervous, and yeah, I've vivid enough recollections of it, actually, and it went very well, and it was the first time I'd ever said some of this stuff out loud, and that
Right.
even after that first session, I felt the same as you, this sense of relief. And I remember
Yeah.
coming home, and I had this image in my head, quite a positive image that I'd never had before, and it was of a really wide open road, and it was completely clear. That was the
Oh,
image I
that's
had in my
lovely.
ear, and it was like to say, right, I can go anywhere here on this road. Let's see where it takes me. But it wasn't
Yes.
cluttered. That was the image I had. It was, for the first time ever, it wasn't cluttered. There weren't cars everywhere. It was completely clear, and it was really wide. I remember that. This, just for whatever reason, that's the image that sat in my head after it. So that was my experience of that. And I remember doing my searches, and this is something I want to ask you about. When I was looking
Yeah.
online at the time, I didn't understand the difference between, say, like a psychotherapist, or like what counselling was, or a psychiatrist, or anything. So, will we maybe have a look at some of those? Like, what's the difference between counselling and psychotherapy, and is there an overlap?
Yes, there is, Barry. And I think in what you've said as well, just around your expectations of the therapy,
Mm,
um, the couch, the
yeah.
the cold um analyst, let's
Yes.
say.
Yeah.
And I guess that there is that type of therapy,
Mm,
which would be psychoanalysis,
okay.
which would probably stem from that Freudian model where the patient is lying on the couch, the analyst is
Yeah.
at the top writing down notes. The person would just free associate. So they will talk about anything they want. And a typical, like very traditional analysis would maybe happen 3 times a week.
Okay.
And the length of time would vary. It could be 20 minutes to 40 minutes. So there's lots of different therapy out there.
Mm,
But I guess if you want to know the difference between psychology and or psychologist and a psychiatrist, we'll look at that. So a psychologist, they would study the mind, the emotions and behavior of a person. They study cognitive and social situations surrounding a person's actions and their reactions.
mm,
So they'll use a variety of therapeutic techniques to work with the patient, and they will work with trauma, or they'll treat many different mental health conditions. So primarily it's talking therapy,
okay.
whereas psychiatry focuses more on the diagnosis and on
Okay.
the medical treatment of
So,
mental health
so is it the
conditions.
psychiatrist who may actually prescribe
Yes,
medication? Okay.
so they're medically trained.
Okay. Okay.
Much like psychologists, psychiatrists will use therapeutic techniques to help their clients, but they have a trained, or they're trained in medical
Mm,
training, and they understand the biological factors of a person's mental health.
yeah.
So a psychologist, they are not in a position to diagnose,
Okay.
whereas a psychiatrist might diagnose a
Okay.
person with um, uh, bipolar disorder
Yeah. Yeah.
or borderline personality disorder,
Right.
and then the psychologist can treat the person
Okay.
using different modalities of therapy.
And am I right in saying there could be some psychologists that don't do that type of work? Could be more like criminal psychologists, or it's not
Yeah,
necessarily they're
there's
not necessarily giving treatment.
no, so there's educational
Hmm.
psychologists, sports psychologists. So they would have an area of expertise in a given area of
Right,
psychology.
right, okay, okay. And can I just ask you again, counselling and psychotherapy, is there a difference?
Yes. So often, initially, when a person is looking for a therapist,
Hmm.
they can get really confused because those terms, counseling and psychotherapy, they're used a lot. And some people will offer just counseling services and
Hmm.
some will offer psychotherapy, or
Right,
some will offer both. My
right.
own training was in counseling and psychotherapy, so they overlap considerably, but there are recognized differences. So the
Hmm.
work of both counselors and psychotherapists with clients may be of considerable depth and length,
Hmm.
but the focus of counseling is more likely to be on specific problems,
Okay,
such as changes in life, adjustments, and just generally fostering the client's well-being.
right,
Psychotherapy, it's more in-depth work,
right,
and it's concerned more with the restructuring of the personality or the self
okay,
and creating insight. So
right.
broadly speaking, counseling focuses on treating unwanted or distressing emotional or behavioral
Hmm.
symptoms.
So it's quite specific
And
usually.
yes,
Yeah.
and the aim of counseling is to ease emotional distress and help you get back to a normal level of functioning.
So a bit like earlier
So
when we spoke about the PTSD, you might receive counselling after a traumatic event, for example.
yes, um, so I'll give you an example. So if somebody is suffering depression following a relationship breakup,
Hmm.
counseling will help overcome the depression so that the
Okay,
person feels better again.
right.
So if we then look at psychotherapy from the client's perspective, it has many similarities with counseling. And again, there's a lot of overlap between the two
Hmm. Hmm.
approaches. For example, they both aim at easing emotional distress so that you can get on with living a normal life
Yeah,
again.
yeah, yeah.
Both approaches will help you to learn more effective ways of managing the problem should the same thing occur in the future.
Hmm.
The difference is, however, is that whilst also attending to a person's immediate symptoms, psychotherapy will have more focus on the underlying aspects of
Okay.
somebody's character structure.
So it's a bit deeper, would you
Yes,
say? Yeah,
and looking at what might have contributed to the problem.
right.
So, in other words, it's what is it about your psychological makeup that might influence the situations you find yourself in?
And is this the point where people may do the, I suppose, with the stereotypical thing of maybe talking about their childhood or that type of thing? So
Yes,
you're often
exactly.
digging
So,
deep.
digging, yes, more the archaeological dig in a sense
Mm,
into your
okay.
personality, your experiences in life so far. And if we look back at the previous example I used of somebody suffering depression following a breakup,
Mm,
psychotherapy will initially try to ease the depression, but then focus more on why this happened.
okay.
So, for example, what were the underlying factors that might have contributed to the relationship
Yeah.
failing?
Okay.
How come this person often ends up with similar experiences in their relationships?
Hmm.
So, I would have a look at the client's family of origin history,
Yeah.
look at their attachment styles,
Hmm.
what patterns and similarities are emerging that were present in their
Yeah. So,
parents'
so it's
relationship.
getting to the root of the issue rather than just
It
treating the
is
symptoms so much. It's getting to the root as to,
getting to, yeah,
okay, not so much fixing the depression, but thinking, well, why? Why are you feeling this
why,
way? Yeah.
yes,
What's causing
looking
this?
at, yeah, looking at the unconscious aspects of the client's psyche
Mm.
and in a sense, bringing them into consciousness.
And that's a
And
big thing I found. Yeah, it was
mm,
because there's so much of this stuff was buried in the subconscious, and the therapeutic process helps you bring it out, and that can be painful sometimes.
Of
It's
course,
not
it
always, and
really can.
we might come back to that in a minute, actually. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a very interesting process. You learn a lot about yourself.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And psychotherapy, it's more long term, in
Okay,
depth.
okay. And the other thing I want to ask, I mean, how can you be sure that the person you're seeking therapy from or counseling from is actually qualified? And is the term like psychotherapist, I think, is like a protected term, but could anyone call themselves a counselor, or is that protected as well? Or how can we be
Well,
sure?
yeah, we have seen there has been a lot of controversy in the media regarding this, that people have been providing counseling or
Hmm.
psychotherapy and aren't actually qualified to do so. So, what I would always advise a person is to ask those questions, to look at the person's qualifications. And at minimum, they really would need to have a primary degree in psychotherapy, counseling, or psychology.
Hmm.
So that's the first thing I would look at. What is their training?
Yeah.
And also then to look at what or who they're registered with.
Okay.
Um, and a lot of people, well, they should be registered with, if they're a psychotherapist or counselor, they should be registered with the Irish Association for Counselling and
Okay.
Psychotherapy.
And I think they have
And then
lists of qualified therapists
they
on that,
do,
which
yes,
is
they've got
could
a
be,
really comprehensive website, Barry,
yeah.
and it will give a list of people that are registered, and a person can go on there and look up a therapist. And
Okay.
there's a great deal of information on their website. And also to look at if a person's qualified as a psychologist, to
Okay.
make sure they're registered as a psychologist as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
So that really, really is important. You need to be sure of the qualifications of the person that is providing the therapy.
Yeah.
And typically, a person will have maybe 4 to 6 years of training
Wow. Okay.
behind them. And also, they will be required to follow a code of ethics
Hmm.
and conduct,
Yes.
and also to engage in continuous professional supervision.
Right. So it's quite
That
tightly
means,
regulated.
yes, it should be highly regulated.
Yeah. Okay.
And also that they continue to engage in continuous professional development.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, as part of my registration, I have to engage in it's about 20 hours of continuous
Right.
professional development per year.
Right. Okay. So new ideas or new types of training, or new
Yes,
research that's come available, that you'd be expected to keep up to date with all of that.
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
it's
Okay.
fundamental. It's
And like,
fundamental.
there's a term I hear bandied about sometimes, life coaches. What are life coaches, and are they qualified?
Again, Barry, I'm not sure if there's much regulation
Yeah.
around life coaching.
Hmm.
It's again looking at what kind of training the person has.
Yeah.
It's, making sure they have a really good
Yeah.
background in whatever it is they're
Hmm.
coaching. So we may have people who, for example, are ADHD coaches.
Hmm. Hmm.
What I would say is that that person would have a really strong background and knowledge
Yes.
of ADHD,
Okay.
and perhaps have a background in psychology as
Okay.
well. And
Yes.
then, as an adjunct, they do some coaching,
Yes.
or training in coaching
Hmm.
around that
Hmm.
very specialized area. But
So
again, it's really looking at a person's qualifications.
yeah. So that's
They
really
haven't
important.
just, yeah, it is that they haven't just done some online 8 week
Yes.
course
And don't be afraid to
and then
ask
all of
these
a sudden,
questions as well.
yeah, like all of a sudden have become a life coach.
Mm.
I think when people go to a coach, of course it has a lot of validity,
Hmm.
but are they specialized in the area that they are coaching in?
Okay.
So
Okay.
that's what I would say.
Yeah. Do your research and make sure.
Do your
Yeah.
research. Yeah.
Because
Don't
I
be
mean,
afraid to ask the questions because you are
mhm.
paying for this service. And be sure that you are getting what you're actually paying for, because it is an
Absolutely.
expensive process as
Yes.
well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next thing I want to move on to is that I remember when I was kind of, I suppose, doing my search and I looked at a couple of different websites and that type of thing. And it's possible that sometimes you don't find the right therapist straight away. Because I know that the therapeutic relationship is quite important, and chemistry is very important, and it that kind of works both ways. That the client has to feel it, the therapist has to feel it. They both have to feel that, yeah, this is a person I can work with. So can you tell me a little bit about this therapeutic relationship, which is kind of unlike any other, and this chemistry?
Yes. So the therapeutic relationship, I guess it's a very unique kind of relationship. So you really need to feel comfortable working with the person who's in front of you.
Mm,
And I mean that from the client's perspective,
yes.
that they need to feel at ease, that this person is, they're going to, I suppose, unravel themselves. And you need to feel that you will be held appropriately. And I say that word very symbolically, Barry,
Hmm.
that what you disclose to the therapist will be kept confidential also.
Yes.
That is one thing, that you need to feel safe in that
Hmm.
environment and safe in the process. Also, the relationship is very boundaried.
Hmm.
Whilst we might develop feelings for our therapist, as in, we can imagine all kinds of things about them.
Mm,
A therapist can become a really important person in our life,
yes.
but there are boundaries there, that during the process of therapy, the therapist is not our friend.
Mm, yeah.
They are somebody who has positive regard for us, who holds space,
Hmm.
who has empathy. There are certain things that the therapist needs to have and
Yeah.
to provide for the client, but it's also, they keep their life separate.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you kind of see the therapist as kind of a blank slate in a way.
Yes,
That
but it's to be, it's not to be cold
yes.
with the client. Um, Again, there are different modalities of therapy, and if we look at more the analysis, the blank canvas, or let's say the
Mm,
therapist provides very little of themselves
yes.
within the space. Now, people can find that quite confronting, but
Mm,
it is about also creating change,
yeah.
observing how the person relates to the therapist.
That's really interesting that you say all that, because I certainly remember, I mean, when you're a client, especially after a while, when you get comfortable in therapy, you're dying to know something about your therapist. You're
Yeah.
absolutely dying to know anything. Even one day, I was waiting, and the therapist actually was slightly late and came up in their car. I was like, "Oh, that's their car." Oh, I finally learned
Yeah.
something tiny little detail.
Mm.
Um, or they might be dressed a certain way, and you say, "Oh, I wonder are they going out somewhere tonight after this?" Or do you know what I mean? You're dying to know something, and that's normal. That's
It is.
ordinary
That's normal.
human curiosity.
Yes, it is. It's to have that. It is. It's curiosity, but I guess often the therapist provides, or the therapist, in a sense, provides that space that can allow the client to change and develop.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that relationship is very, very important. And it can be
Hmm.
confronting at times.
Oh,
We
definitely.
mightn't like our therapist. There will be
Okay.
times when we don't, and that's
Right.
okay. But it's about again, maybe rupture in the relationship and how the relationship is repaired.
Interesting. And
And
that
it gives
seems
a
to be,
chance for
yeah,
change.
that seems to be a pattern in therapy, and I've often seen it, and we might come back to that later in movies or TV shows. I know this is a trope for television or movies, but there's often that rupture followed by the
Yes,
repair. I think anyone who's seen The King's Speech will see that. Although I don't think that was a qualified therapist, but anyway, but there was a rupture and then a repairing of the relationship in a healthy way.
yes,
And that was interesting. But a lot of this comes down to a word that some people may have heard: transference, where the client will also often transfer a lot of emotions, feelings onto the therapist, or maybe even assign them a role. It could be a mother role or a sister or anything. And that's
yes.
actually an important. That can be quite difficult, but it's actually quite important, isn't it?
It is. And we're going into psychotherapy here,
Mm,
Barry. That's really how psychotherapy, or how a psychotherapist would operate, in a sense that the client will, as you said, you use the word transfer.
mm,
So a lot of unconscious processes will
mm,
happen in that space.
mm.
So the client may reenact or act out with the therapist in a
Yes,
way that maybe they've acted out in the past,
yes.
which has caused their relationships to be dysfunctional.
Hmm.
The therapist has to become very aware and very attuned into their client to observe this happening.
Hmm.
And in a
Hmm.
sense, it will give the client an opportunity to re-experience something or a
Okay.
relationship
Hmm.
where there's an opportunity for change.
Right.
So it sounds a little bit gobbledygook.
Yeah,
So maybe
yeah,
we can have a look at that, of how it
yeah,
might play out.
yeah.
So again, a client may come into the space and have had, let's say, a very difficult relationship with a parent,
Yeah.
for
Okay.
example.
Okay.
So, in a sense, when they go into the therapy, the the therapist may represent this parent figure,
Mm.
and the client begins to act out in all kinds of ways.
Okay. Yeah.
So, the job of the therapist, in a sense, is to hold the relationship, to not react in a punitive way,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
to provide some gentle feedback,
Okay.
which
Okay.
allows maybe the client to experience change.
Right.
In a sense, I'm allowed to be my worst self in this room.
Okay. Right.
I am going to talk about stuff that is really disturbing for me,
Hmm.
but you're not going to run away from me.
Yeah.
And that offers such a sense of relief
Yeah. Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
client,
Yeah.
that
Definitely.
they feel for maybe the first time in their whole life not judged.
Yeah. That's
That,
huge, isn't it? Yeah.
yes, whatever is shameful or dark or that you've been holding on to for years,
Mm.
you finally get the opportunity to talk about it. And you're not judged, or you don't feel
Yeah.
judged.
Yeah.
And that can be
Definitely.
really transformative. A
Definitely.
lot of the times, Barry, we have the answers inside ourselves,
Mm.
but we don't have the space to reflect on them or to process them.
And I often found in therapy, my therapist rarely gave me advice, but rather
Mhm.
kind of helped me to tease out myself that answer that was
Yes.
there. And I remember one session in particular, really with struggling with something to do, and the therapist saying to me, "You know which one you want to do here. You do know." And
Mm.
eventually, I came to it myself, and that was far more be powerful than being told this is what you should do.
Yes,
You know,
that's
and
true.
and often it's bringing this stuff out to the surface that's often buried very deep inside in the psyche, if we're getting really deep into it, and it's kind of bringing that to the surface. And what that brings me to, that can be very, very difficult and very painful. And you talked about sometimes acting out or that type of thing. And I always remember, I don't know, it was about 6, 7 sessions in or something. And I came in, I said, yeah, no, I had a great week and everything went well and it's good and everything's great. The therapist stopped and said, that's great, but I don't want to hear about any of that.
Yes.
I don't want to hear what's great. I
What's
want to hear,
good and what's great.
yeah, yeah, that's fine.
So it,
I want to
yeah,
hear
it
what's
sounds
not
like
so good.
no, it sounds like your therapist had observed something, and
Yeah,
maybe that was a pattern in you. I
yeah,
don't know, Barry,
very
that
possibly.
presenting as everything is fine, everything is
Yeah,
hunky dory, people pleasing
yes.
aspect,
And it took
and
that time to
yeah,
finally, took me a while to kind of get comfortable and eventually dig down and bring this stuff up. And my initial reaction to that was like, hey, back off,
yeah.
back off here. I don't want to talk about this,
Hmm.
and that I think that's a very normal reaction.
It is. No one really wants to feel or re-experience pain again.
Mm,
And
definitely.
however often we need to go through the tunnel to get to the other side as such.
Without a
And
doubt.
that's why the relationship between therapist and client is so important and fundamental to the therapy.
Yeah.
Your therapist needs to travel with you
Yes.
through
Yeah.
that journey. And it is a healing journey.
Mm,
If you don't feel comfortable with that person, you're not going to
mm,
go there.
yeah.
And what I would say to anybody is shop around.
Yeah. Yeah.
You might not like the therapist.
Hmm.
And if you don't feel comfortable with them, you're not going to be able to do the work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Often, as we go through the therapy, we hate our
Oh,
therapist.
you go
And
through
that's part of
phases.
the process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, as I said, there was that feeling of back off. But however, I will say it was only when I began to really be honest, and not just honest with the therapist, be honest with myself,
Yeah.
right? That's when the healing began. That's when the
Mm.
work really, really began. When you got down into the kind of nitty gritty. And I remember saying, I think it was just before Christmas, and there was going to be a little gap. And my therapist said, well, how do you feel about the year ahead? And I said something, you know what? It's going to be rough. It's going to be
Oh,
rough. There's going to be conflict. But bring it on. And that was the point I knew I was ready to really go at it. And it took me a few months to get to that point. And I said,
yes.
right, and I did do it, and there was conflict, and there was very difficult moments, and there was me maybe facing some stuff about myself that I didn't want to face.
Mm.
But I did, and then as you said, when you finally verbalize it, and you weren't judged, instead you were supported. Wow, what a relief! Just like a weight would lift there and then off your shoulders. And
It
often it was a
does.
case, and then you'd make the connection. So you dig a bit more and you go, oh, that's why I do that. So that's
Yeah.
why I react the way I do. And it was as if a shackle shouldn't suddenly just smashed off you. And you were like,
Mm.
I don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah.
I don't.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that would happen in the session. Funnily enough, sometimes it would happen on the way to the bus stop afterwards. The realization would
Yes.
hit. Sometimes it would happen the next day or during the week.
Hmm.
And it was really interesting. It was like a series of kind of aha moments
Yeah.
where you'd make a connection, usually with something from your past or a relationship or something like that, or an experience. You go, that's why I do that, or that's why I react the way I do. And it was such a liberating feeling to make that connection. And make even the connection alone often was enough to do a huge amount of repair work. And then you'd maybe combine that with a little bit of CBT, a new technique maybe,
Yes.
to just redirect your thought process. Um, I think the one I had was about like decoupling a thought, where I'd have a negative thought and to imagine it like a train carriage and to just decouple it and let it go. It's not real. It's
Let
only a
it
thought.
go. Yeah.
It's only a thought. This isn't actually
Yeah.
happening.
It's not real.
It's not
Yes.
real. This scenario I've dreamt up in my life, it's not actually happening.
Yeah.
So
And we can become so attached to those thoughts that it's when somebody actually reflects it back to us
yeah,
that we can see, gosh, there is a different way of thinking. I'm so fixed on these patterns
yeah,
and these behaviors. So there can often be a disruption in those that the therapist creates, and it allows you a new opportunity to look at things differently.
yeah.
But one thing that I find, Barry, is that being able to sit in front of somebody
Mm,
and being able to pour my heart out, to go
yeah.
into the deepest recesses of my soul, let's say,
Mm,
and just to be listened to.
yeah.
That is transformative for me.
Oh,
I don't
huge.
want answers.
Yeah,
I want somebody to sit with me in my pain.
yeah.
And I don't want one of my friends to do that with me.
Mm,
I want somebody who, I'm not going to socialize with,
yes.
or,
Yeah.
somebody who's going to maybe possibly tell somebody else
Yes.
or judge me. So
Yeah.
sitting there with somebody and just being able to be me, to just get it out what I'm holding on to, or when I'm really overwhelmed and I just need to sit there with that person and say, I'm really feeling bad in
Yeah.
myself right now.
Yeah.
I feel like a bad person.
Mm,
This is what I've done, or these are the thoughts I'm having that are really uncomfortable.
yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes they're just normalized.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
Definitely.
person may come back to me and say, that's really a normal way to feel after what you've
Yeah.
experienced.
Yeah.
Or this is what that possibly is.
Yeah. It's
It's
very
being
powerful.
heard, being understood. And that is powerful.
Yeah.
And
And
having a space to
that space,
offload.
exactly, the safe space.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you as well, I just want to go back to something, because we spoke about transference, and you spoke about how when you do your training, you do your own therapy. So to make sure when you're in the session, you're not thinking, oh God, I feel like that too. But I mean,
Yes.
there's bound to be times that happens. And I think they call it counter transference, don't they? And I mean,
Yes,
and is that, could you explain a little bit what that is, and how would a therapist deal with that? And again, it's a normal part of the process, isn't it?
it is. So, for example, Barry, you might come to see me for therapy,
Yeah.
and something you say to me triggers something in
Okay.
me, and I might
Right.
have a reaction,
Right.
maybe not a favorable reaction
Okay.
towards you because you've triggered something in me.
Interesting.
And I may say something out of turn, or I may react in a way that might be cold or dismissive.
Right.
So, but that's coming from something inside of me that I
Yeah.
haven't really looked at.
Okay.
And the way around that is that the therapist needs to be on their game.
Yeah.
Essentially, they need to be on track.
Mm.
And what happens is, as a therapist, I'm tracking also my engagement
Okay.
with the client. And if something has come up, I then need to bring that to my supervision.
Yes.
And my supervision isn't a therapy session.
Hmm.
It's where the supervisor can objectively look at the situation and they can give you some guidance.
Hmm.
And my supervisor may say to me, look, this is really how you could handle this.
Mm.
Or let's look at a form of therapy that might work well with that
Yeah.
client.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or Amber, this is something that's about you,
Yeah.
and you've got some unresolved stuff there. Get
Yeah.
yourself back into
Yeah,
therapy.
but this shows me as well just how important it is to get the qualified person who knows what they're doing. Because
It
like what I'm
is.
getting here, there's a lot to this. It's heavy. It's tough going, and you really got to know what you're doing. You really need to be with the person who knows what they're doing. Because if you're with
Absolutely.
somebody
And
who's unqualified, they could do a lot of damage.
they can, but also they may not recognize that the person needs really some maybe a different kind of support, that there may be something more serious going on, and that they can determine that, and also they can refer out, that the therapist also knows their limitations, or they know what they won't work with, or what's difficult for them to work with.
Yeah. And so when you meet a client for the first time or whatever, what so say somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, right, I might give this a go. What do you expect from the client going in that will help them help themselves?
So initially, when a client first makes contact with me, I will always send them some paperwork. So I'll send them an intake form where I'll just ask some general questions, just, age, maybe GP, next of kin, those kind of questions. And also any kind of medical history, that's important. If there's any history of mental health issues in the family, are they on any medication? Just generally those kind of normal type questions. When the client initially presents, I will ask them why they've decided to come to therapy. So I'll get an idea of the presenting issues, and we will talk about that. I might take a brief history, look at if they've been in therapy before, what their past experiences of therapy have been like. So I'll get just an idea of why they're there, what the issue is at hand. And afterwards, my own work is really looking at formulating, I suppose, a therapy intervention for the person. Looking at some goals of therapy, and also asking the client what they want from the therapy. What are their expectations?
And sometimes I remember there was goals that didn't become clear till later on in the process. I remember you think, oh, that's something I didn't realize I was doing. I need to maybe look at that. A lot of the stuff you say is subconscious. You don't know you're doing it. I just want to ask one other thing, and this is probably the most ridiculous question I'm going to ask today, and I know how you're going to answer it. It's how long does therapy last generally? And I might as well be asking how long is a piece of string, but I'm guessing it depends is the answer.
Yeah, that's true, Barry. It really depends. People can come for maybe 3 sessions and they go, okay, yep, got the answer to that. I know what's wrong. I just needed to offload. Or a person may find that lots of things begin to crop up as they go through the process, and they're very dedicated to it. They want to know more about themselves, what makes them tick, per se, and they may go into therapy for a couple of years. I myself, I see a therapist as and when I need to, but it's been the same therapist for years. I know her, she knows me. I don't have to explain myself. I'm comfortable with her. I don't have to repeat my story again and again. And life crops up and different things happen. So inevitably, I'll engage in therapy for maybe it could be a couple of months at a time, or it might be just a couple of weeks.
So you can dip in and out, basically.
Dip in and out, yes.
And I will say to people, it is my absolute firm belief that everyone should do therapy at some point in their life. And I think the kind of early 30s is a particularly good time to do it, because it's a time in your life where, so as your 20s are over, that things are happening. Could be getting married, having children. There's a lot of stuff. Career things can be happening around that time. And I think it's a really good time to do that work, because I think it sets you up quite well for what's coming next in your life. That's just my opinion anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you, Barry. And also, I think for children, for teenagers, it's to give them access to counselors or psychologists, psychotherapists. It's really, really important. Again, it's giving them a safe place They might not feel comfortable talking to mum or dad.
Yeah, that's
So
okay.
it's offering them a space where they can talk
Yeah,
about what's going on or what's troubling them.
yeah,
I think it's great that schools are getting involved in
yes.
mental health. I wish that was around when I was growing up.
Without a doubt,
It
yeah,
really would have helped. It gives kids the tools to navigate their way through life.
yeah.
I know my own children have engaged in therapy
Mm, mm,
invariably when stuff has happened.
yeah,
And I felt, well, I'm not the person really to, I'm their mum,
yeah.
but I also want to provide them with something extra.
Yes, exactly. And the schools are
And
great now. I've
yeah,
seen it in my own son's school, and he's done a little bit too. I can see little bits of anxiety like me there. So, but the difference
yes,
is catch it early and say, right. And I've often
exactly.
said to him, if you're seeing the school counselor, that's your space. You don't have to tell me what you say. You can if you
No,
want, but you don't have to. And the other thing is, maybe the thing you want to say is, God, Dad is really annoying me today. I
of
wish he'd. Da, da, da."
course.
And you know what? You can do that because they'd be
Yes.
self-conscious saying it to you. But like, yeah, feel free if you want to. If I'm the one who's bothering you that day, say it.
Yeah.
Don't be
It's
afraid.
really teaching them from an early age that it is okay to talk, that there are people out there who you can turn to for help and support.
Yeah, yeah. Without a doubt. I,
Mm.
I want to ask you something, and I'm going to talk about it as well. And we kind of touched on this. As a client, I'm asking this. Is there anything that surprised you about the therapeutic process?
Me,
Yeah,
when I
as
received,
a client, yeah.
right.
Because I mean, have a think about that, and,
Mm.
and I'll kind of tell you my. I mean, I think I already mentioned it. Was the expectation of the cold analytical therapist, and I suppose at the time I was watching the series Frasier, and that was kind of my.
Oh,
That's the only place I'd seen it, or films like Goodwill Hunting, or the series Mad Men, where they portray the really cold psychoanalyst. And what I surprised me was the warmth and humanity of the therapist, which it took me by surprise in a nice way. But one of the things that got me, and I think it was might have even been the very first session, maybe the second one, was when the therapist turned to me and said, "Oh, tell me about your mother," and I just burst out laughing. Because and I was like, "Do you really ask that? Is that actually a thing?" Because that was kind of one of
yes.
the stereotypes, to tell me about your mother thing, and I actually just burst out laughing because I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
really? Is that a thing they do?"
Yeah. And I guess that really, what your therapist probably was looking at was attachment.
Yes. Okay.
Um, so attachment theory is really strong with within psychotherapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they will ask you, they'll look at the relationship between our primary caregivers.
Yeah.
It really forms the, how can I say, it it's very indicative of how we will relate
Yeah.
as adults
And
within
and that
our
attachment, I know, and we
relationships.
won't go into too much detail on that at the
Mm,
moment, because I know there are different types, like secure attachment, insecure, and then there's kind of one in the middle,
yes.
isn't there? Kind of like a disorganized,
Disorganized,
yeah,
yeah,
attachment. They
attachment,
said
yeah.
it's not really the time to go into that, but like there can be any number of factors with that, and they can really go back to the beginning. I mean, one of the things I spoke about, I remember, was the fact that I was very, very premature. I was nearly 2 months premature. I weighed 2 pounds when I was born.
Wow.
Now I think I've gained that since this morning. Uh, but like and I spent the first kind of 4 months of my life in a glass box
Yes,
away from my mother and father. You know what I mean? Without that contact, through nobody's fault. It was just they had to keep me
that's how it was
alive.
done.
That was
Yeah,
the priority, was keep them. But like, I mean, no doubt that has an effect. And you
of
mightn't
course.
think it. You think I don't remember
Yeah.
that, but of course it does.
And when you look at it now, that mothers will be with their babies, even if they're born prematurely, or
Mm, mm.
there's time where the baby, they call it the kangaroo care,
Yes,
where
yes.
baby will lie skin to skin. with the mum or the dad.
Yeah.
So it's all that touch, all that smell, all of that. It's so important for helping the baby to develop a secure attachment.
to bond. I remember even doing that. It was 2014. And I remember when my son was born, bringing him home, and the World Cup was on at the time. And I remember there's a great photo of the two of us, and I'm on the couch, and we're skin to skin and wrapped in a
Yeah,
really cozy blanket, the kangaroo care, and I'm watching the match. And, it was just such a lovely bonding experience.
it is. It
And
really
it
helps the baby.
really helps, and it helps the parents as well.
Of course
It's
it does. Yeah.
a very beautiful experience, actually, that kind of closeness, and you can nearly
Yes.
see it in their face, that kind of feeling of safety and
Mm.
contentness, and I've a lovely photo of that somewhere, and yeah, but like I said, in my experience, unfortunately, just due to the fact, I mean, that the priority was just kind of keep me alive,
Keep you
kind
alive.
of
Yeah.
thing, and amazing medical staff in the Rotunda who did just that, um, 44 years ago, we'll say
Oh,
now.
wow.
Born in 1979, so you can guess what my middle name is. Like every
Oh,
boy born
John
in,
Paul,
yeah,
is it?
absolutely, like every single boy born in
Yeah.
1970. I think my dad even wrote a letter to the Pope and got a reply while I was still
Oh,
in the hospital, which was very nice. But so that's that. What about you? Is anything that surprised you? I actually from either side of the room.
yeah. I guess one of the things probably was the just normalizing my feelings, that
Yeah.
I wasn't weird or damaged,
Okay. Yeah.
that what I was feeling was probably normal. And I guess one of the other things that I learned really about myself was my delayed reactions.
Okay.
And often, if really, something difficult has happened,
Mm.
I don't react.
Yeah.
I won't react for a couple of days, and then it all, comes out
I think that's
as
common.
such.
You hear it with people
Yeah,
like
and
when there's a
again, it's
death in the family, it's often after
yeah,
the funeral has happened that
afterwards,
that's when it hits.
and that's self-preservation.
Mm.
So I learned what that was, and when now I know to expect that.
Yes.
So if something happens, I think probably one of the most traumatic things that happened in recent years was my father's sudden death, and
Mm.
I was living in Australia, so I had to make that journey across to Ireland. But at the
Yeah.
time, I was just very detached. It was just about getting through it,
Mm.
organizing things, getting
Yeah.
flights, getting
Yeah.
passport, all of that. It was only afterwards, a couple of months afterwards, that I felt it.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand what was going on because I wasn't really coping effectively.
Mm.
And it was in therapy. Again, I decided, no, I'm not doing too well here. I need to
Yeah.
go and
Yeah.
speak to somebody.
Yeah.
This is affecting my work. And uh, it was there that I really discovered I was having a delayed reaction.
Yes.
But I was offered the space where I could grieve, I could go through
Mm.
what I needed to go through at the
Yeah.
time.
And it's interesting what you said at the beginning there, as you kind of go in and think, oh God, what are they going to think of me if I say this? And
Yeah,
what's a lovely thing is we often have a fear of being judged, don't we, by the
we
therapist? And that's
do.
so important that it's a non-judgmental space.
Yes.
And you can say these things without fear of judgment. I'm going to move on because we're coming not too far from the end now. Um, Another thing I want to say is with the therapeutic process, especially with psychotherapy, which can be more long term, often you can complete therapy and think, yeah, I've got to the end of this and this is great, and then suffer a relapse. Is that a common thing to happen?
It is. Yeah, that's fairly, not that can be, again, normal.
Yeah.
And as I've said, Barry, therapy can be a lifelong process because life is forever evolving and changing, and we as people evolve and change.
Yeah.
So sometimes that you may need to go back because you, as you've said, you've relapsed.
Mm.
And you find yourself engaging in dysfunctional patterns of behavior,
Mm.
again, to help manage or to help
Yes.
cope. So that might be, for example, drinking heavily, or maybe beginning to use drugs just to help cope, to ease the symptoms.
Yes.
And then a person may find themselves spiraling.
Yeah.
Because they turn to whatever is easiest at the time. So they may need to then go back into therapy, and that's okay.
Yeah, and that
There
was
never
my
be any
case.
judgment, or there shouldn't be any judgment from the
No,
therapist.
it was my case, and I nearly see it as it was nearly inevitable looking back, and that it was nearly a necessary part of the process. And the thing is, I thought the relapse was much harder than the original because it was coupled with this disappointment. Oh, I thought I was done with all that. I thought I
Yes.
was done, and then hits again. You're like, oh no, but looking back, it was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. Hard as it was, because it allowed me to kind of tie up those loose ends and finish the job, if you know what I mean.
And also probably that's indicative of your growth as well, Barry. Generally, people, for example, with trauma in particular, a person won't really face that until they're ready.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can go through certain things and work through stuff in our therapy only as much as we are able to at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then roll on maybe a couple of years later, we're ready to do another piece of work.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
But also, as I've said, life can throw curveballs.
Definitely.
And you may say to yourself, you know what, I'm not handling this too good. So I need to go back into therapy. And that's okay. And it's never a failure. This is about your growth as a person.
And it's a process. I've kind of come to the conclusion now that I suppose we all have to stop thinking in terms of, right, I'm fixed now. We're never fixed. There's no such thing as fixed. There'll always be stuff that'll crop up. But what I do remember after the second time, and maybe a year later, I ended up having to face a very difficult situation. And it was the first time I did it kind of solo, without the support of a therapist. A really difficult, unpleasant situation. And
how did it go?
Well, it took a few months, but I navigated it and I came out the other side and I was fine.
Great.
And that's the thing. And I remember after that thinking, wow, I couldn't have done that a few years ago, and I handled it. And I'm not saying it was easy, it wasn't, but I kept my head above water. I used techniques that I'd learned, used mindfulness, other things like that, and I came out the other side of it, and came out the other side of it much stronger and more confident. Kind of got my confidence back, because I was like, you know what, I handled it, I did it.
You did.
I came through the other side.
You had the tools.
Yes.
And then you developed a trust in yourself.
That's it.
That you could do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing now, I just like it would say we're really close to the end now. We've spoken about starting therapy and the whole process and the different things and relapses and all that. When do you know it's getting time to bring therapy to a close?
It's something that you'll find yourself, you'll know that, I feel I'm kind of done now. I feel confident to move on.
Yeah.
Your therapist may also have come to that conclusion and discussed that with you.
Yeah.
So it comes in a sense to a natural ending. And you both will discuss that. And move on from there.
Yeah.
But I would say to people, don't be afraid to reach out, to start that journey. And there's lots of places also, Bart. People may say, oh, it's too expensive, and it can be expensive.
Yeah.
But there are also lots of services that provide free support. And I think we can attach that to this episode as well, Barry, where people find lots of affordable treatments. And that can be through online therapy. It can be over the phone. So there's organizations such as Pieta House,
Yes.
and they provide face-to-face therapy face-to-face therapy sessions for people who are suicidal or who engage in self-harm. There's Childline, again, that's a free confidential listening service.
Yes.
There's the Samaritans, and again, they provide a 24-hour phone, text, or email service. Nightline, Aware.
Right. So we might put some of these on underneath this the video. We'll put some of those links in for people to have a look at. One last kind of thing, just before we finish, we mentioned this in one of the earlier podcasts that sometimes therapy can be combined with medication. Is that something that can happen?
Of course. So they're combined therapy, and that's also really good. So a person may be prescribed medication from their psychiatrist or GP. So, and then also engage in a talking therapy as well, which works great
together. Yeah, and it's okay if it's suggested you need medication. That's fine. Some people have a bit of a hang up saying, "Oh, I don't want to take," you know what I mean? It's okay.
It's very much a personal choice.
Yeah.
And there's so many different types of medications that can really help people. And it can be about chemical imbalance.
Yes.
I often look at it like a car engine.
Yeah.
So the car, it needs kind of some batteries to recharge it. The battery's gone dead. The medication is like that, the sparks that will just bring it back to life or to functioning again. So particularly when there's a clinical diagnosis, so the person may need depression. There's no shame to that at all.
Absolutely,
whatsoever.
And combining
it with the
therapy.
The real shame is when a person doesn't get the support or help that they need.
Exactly, definitely. And like to finish up, two kind of questions I just want to ask you personally. Is there any particular areas of psychology that you find interesting?
Oh, I find it all interesting.
Right.
I wouldn't even know where to start there.
Right. Yeah. It is a fascinating area, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. I definitely like the attachment stuff, the early childhood development.
And I think we have books in the library by John Bowlby and is it Mary Ainsworth? I think they did all the attachment.
They did, a lot of research on
very famous experiments where I think the mother's in the room with the baby and then the mother leaves and they kind of observe it and a stranger comes in and I think they did the same. I was reading they did a similar experiment with dogs, and the dogs had a very similar reaction to humans, whereas cats just didn't care. They just kind of had no reaction whatsoever. So I don't know what that tells us. And the last thing I want to ask you, a bit of a general question, a bit of fun to finish up with. We often see psychotherapy and counselling being portrayed on television or in movies, and I'm watching Frasier at the moment, or Good Will Hunting was a famous one with Robin Williams, some very famous scenes. There was a series called In Treatment. There was therapy scenes in Mad Men. There's one at the moment with Harrison Ford called Shrinking. How accurate do you think those portrayals are? Do they often get it a bit wrong, or sometimes do they get it right? Or
some of them get it right, and I'm actually thinking of a particularly funny one. That show Afterlife with Ricky Gervais. So his character goes to see a psychologist, and the psychologist is probably everything that we don't want to find in psychologists. Completely unboundaried, very inappropriate. So, but that's actually very funny. That take on it. Probably In Treatment was quite good. With Gabriel Byrne.
Yes, I watched that.
But it's not to be afraid, and your therapist is the human being just like you. Most probably they've been through a lot themselves. Which is why they've ended up on the other side of the couch.
Yes, as we said, the charm, the wounded healer. And I think that's a good place to finish up on. So thank you so much, Amber. learned so much from that. And it was interesting for me to think back to that process. And maybe I'll do it again someday if I need it. And if I do, that's fine. That's, and I'd
Yes,
encourage everyone to dip in and out as you feel you need it. And listen, anyone who's listening and you're thinking about, maybe this is a step you want to take, I hope this podcast maybe help demystify it as we called it, and maybe gave you an idea of what to expect, and maybe lessen some of your fears around the process. Don't be afraid to give it a go.
that's it, Barry. Don't be afraid, and don't let anything get in the way of that, or money be a barrier. As we've said, there's lots of free services that people can access at the moment. And it's just taking the plunge and investing in yourself.
Yeah.
You won't look back.
Yeah, and even
That's
in
what I can
in
say.
Blanchardstown Library, we have the Jigsaw service sharing our building for young people, and they do incredible work, and we've done some projects with them in the past. Like, so there are options out there. And in one of our last podcasts, we spoke about mental health for students, and
Yes.
Jigsaw is certainly a service that students could access. It's the right age group, so whatever you do, don't suffer alone. Don't be afraid to get a bit of
No.
help. And our best wishes to anyone who does decide to go down that route.
Yes, absolutely. And Barry, I really appreciate you sharing your own experience, and I think it will help a lot of the listeners out there.
I hope so. I hope so. I think it's important. One of the elements of the EU mental health initiative is trying to remove the stigma of mental health issues. And that's one of the reasons I'm quite happy to speak freely about my own experiences, because if that helps remove some of the stigma and normalize the idea of going to therapy, well, I think that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely.
So we leave it
Thank
at
you
that.
so much.
And thank you for joining us. We'll be going again soon. We have a few more topics to cover, and some of them we kind of touched on today, and we'll delve into them in a little bit more detail in future podcasts. So thanks a million for that, Amber.
Okay, Barry, take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.